Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our July Star Talk. We have Dr. Cherry to talk on searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. Dr. NG is a doctor researcher at Dunlap Institute of Astronomy and Astrophysics. Dr. NG's main topic interest lies in the area of pulsar and transients, as well as signaling processing algorithms for telescope instrumentation. So, without any further ado, let's call Dr. NG.
Thanks for the introduction. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks again for having me here today. I would like to share with you today the topic of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence using the MeerKAT and the Very Large Array VLA telescopes. So I've already been introduced, and my name is Cherry Ng. I'm a project scientist for the MeerKAT and VLA SETI search projects. I'm physically based at the University of Toronto at the Dunlap Institute, but I'm also jointly affiliated with UC Berkeley and the SETI Institute. Okay, let's jump right in. In the last few years, the Kepler mission has discovered thousands of exoplanets. It is estimated that roughly 1 in 5 stars has an exoplanet orbiting the so-called habitable zone where water exists in liquid form. Well, that means overall, there are likely billions of Earth-like worlds in just our galaxy alone. With the advancement in technology on our own Earth, now is a really good time to conduct a large-scale search to find life elsewhere in the universe. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, also known as SETI, focuses on the search for technosignature, which are signals that are emitted by other advanced civilizations. This is analogous to a complementary field of research that looks for biosignature, which are molecular lines like water, for example. So what exactly is this technosignature that we are looking for? To be honest, we don't really know because we haven't detected any yet. But we can make some educated guess of what a potential SETI signal might look like, and so where to start looking for them. One obvious first step is to take inspiration from human-made technology that are in space, and how do they look from Earth? On the left, you can see the signal of the Voyager spacecraft detected by the Green Bank radio telescope. Human technology has been really successful in using filters to concentrate information in a small region of the spectrum. You might have the experience firsthand if you're in a car trying to tune into a certain radio station. And if you just change the frequency by a bit, then you pick up a different channel radio station already. So, and you can see from this plot here, the Voyager signal is very narrow in frequency, which is in the x-axis. This is in comparison to astrophysical emission that tends to be a lot wider in bandwidth. So astrophysical signals tend to be broadband in nature. Another characteristic for technosignature is the drift rate that you can see from the same plot here, the fact that the signal is drifting in time and in frequency. This Doppler drift arises due to the relative acceleration between the receiver on Earth and this potential transmitter that might be on a star or an exoplanet. You can see in this cartoon on the right how the star and the exoplanet could have a relative motion compared to the Earth. They might be moving sort of away from Earth in some orbital phase, or maybe they are moving towards Earth. And subsequently, the signal we detect from this object will appear blue shifted or red shifted. So in contrast, if it were a stationary signal generated by human technology on Earth, we would not have this differential drift. And the signal would appear as a vertical line as opposed to being drifted in time and frequency like the Voyager signal. And how will we go about looking for SETI signal? What kind of instrument can we use? I've mentioned at the beginning of my talk, MeerKAT and the VLA telescopes. Now, both of these are radio telescopes. And so you might wonder, why do we want to use radio telescope to look for SETI? And there are two main reasons for that. One is that radio is relatively cheap to produce. And as a matter of fact, human civilization has been using radio telecommunication for decades now. And you see here some examples like TV radio, radar and spacecraft communication. So in that sense, we might expect any extraterrestrial civilization to do the same. Another thing that you can see from this figure is the fact that our atmosphere is transparent to radio waves. So this is the radio band, and the atmosphere is transparent to it. So that means from Earth, we can relatively easily detect any incoming radio waves because it can pass through the atmosphere as opposed to other regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. All in all, SETI search involves a huge parameter space. So we've talked about the differential drift rate that is due to the unknown orbital and rotational parameter of the host star or planet. So that is one parameter space that we have to search, the a priori unknown drift rate. And then we talked about the frequency range. So we talked about why it might be interesting to look in the radio band. And in fact, it has been suggested that certain parts of the radio band might be particularly interesting. There is this so-called water hole at 1400 to 1600 megahertz. It's interesting because this is an otherwise relatively quiet band in the interstellar radio noise background. So you might think that this is a good place to look for SETI signal. And then what about sky coverage? Overall, it is estimated that there could be 100 to 400 billion stars in just our Milky Way galaxies. So if you want to be thorough, you want to search for all of them. That's a lot of stars. And then we have to think about the time domain. The fact that SETI signal could be intermittent, they might not always be there. So if you looked at a star today and you didn't find anything, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is nothing there tomorrow. And finally, one other thing we might want to consider is the telescope sensitivity. So how far can we detect a potential transmitter signal from an extraterrestrial origin? Obviously, more sensitive telescope is better. And in the literature, a lot of people have used the Arecibo planetary radar, which has for a long time been the most powerful radar on Earth, emitting a power of 10 to the 13 watts. So people have been using Arecibo as a sort of reference point or hallmark to compare any SETI searches of, say, how far can we detect an Arecibo-like transmitter from Earth. I think by now it is clear that SETI search is a huge endeavor. It's a lot of parameter space to look. So this is where Breakthrough Listen initiative comes in. Breakthrough Listen is a 10-year, $100 million program in search for the evidence of technological civilizations in the universe. So the main goal of Breakthrough Listen is to survey 100 nearby galaxies, the entire Milky Way galactic plane, and to monitor 1 million stars through in a wide range of radio and optical frequency band. So big single dish radio telescopes have been the main facilities of Breakthrough Listens from the start. So the two main instruments Breakthrough Listen has been using is the Green Bank radio telescope in the US. It is a very sensitive instrument, 105 meter in diameter, as well as the other one is Parkes radio telescope in Australia, 64 meter in diameter, also a very sensitive radio telescope. So thus far, Breakthrough Listen has observed using these two telescopes over 1,000 targets. and is amounting to about 2 petabytes of data, and all of which is made publicly available. And you can find them at this web link here. And anybody is welcome to look into the data and search for a SETI signal or use it in other ways you like. However, this survey speed is still suboptimal. 1,000 stars sounds a lot, but this is nothing compared to the total number of stars in our Milky Way galaxy. And so this is why there is a renewed SETI effort using interferometric radio telescopes. Radio interferometric telescope works by combining multiple small antennas together to achieve high sensitivity instead of one giant antenna. So you can see in the background of this slide here, the MeerKAT telescope, which has all these small antennas. And now the small size of the antenna actually has another advantage. And the fact is that a small dish means they can see a larger area of the sky at a given time. So this makes the concept of commensal beamforming interesting. Now what is that? In this cartoon, I'm showing a MeerKAT observation that might be looking at a pulsar, for example. Now, however, because of the small-ish size of the MeerKAT antenna, it actually has sensitivity to a large instantaneous field of view, not just at the pulsar, but an sort of wider area around the pulsar as well. So what we can do is that we can form additional coherent beams, and these are represented by the blue cones here. So we can point these software formed beams to other stars in the background at the same time. So effectively, it's like having multiple telescopes looking at different stars all in the same time. Another novel aspect of our project is the ability to conduct the so-called commensal observation. Now, using multicast Ethernet technology, you can see here the data from the antenna is sent to this multicast Ethernet, and then now multiple observers can actually subscribe to the same data stream. So primary observers, so yes, whoever has requested telescope time, they are getting the target, like the pulsar that they want, but other people can also subscribe and process the data in different ways. So one of those backend is this BLUs, and that is our equipment, the breakthrough listen user supplied equipment. So essentially we are piggybacking on all the observations, and we can be conducting SETI searches at the same time while other astronomers use the telescope to for their research projects. Now, it's very important to make sure our system won't introduce extra stress to the telescope, so that we can operate commensally with other projects. So Daniel Check is our postdoc with Dave McMahon. They have been the key drivers for the data acquisition system. And just last year, they have demonstrated the success of the so-called N-shot mode, where we can automatically record a specific number of observations concurrently with other observers. This is a figure made by one of our students, Nick, showing the, in gray is the uptime of the telescope from October last year to earlier this year. And the green bar here is the uptime of the BLUs commensal equipment. And so it's really encouraging to see that since around last Christmas, we have been included in a large fraction of the observations. The Breakthrough Listen team is currently working with 2 flagship interferometer telescopes. And these are MeerKAT telescope in South Africa and the Very Large Array VLA in the US. So here are some key parameters of the instrument. MeerKAT has 64 antennas, and each of them is 13 meters. So you see quite a lot smaller than Green Bank or Parkes. The VLA has 27 antennas, and they're a little bit bigger, 25 meter in diameter. They both have a pretty wide frequency band. The VLA is even has even more coverage on the higher frequency end. Now, a fun fact here is that the VLA telescope has actually been featured in a great movie about SETI search called Contact. I don't know if you've seen it. It came out in 1997, so a little bit old now, but it's a really great movie if you want to check it out. However, this project now is really the first time VLA is involved in a large-scale SETI search. So that's pretty nice, because finally a movie in 1997 is coming true. Now, MeerKAT and VLA, they are going to be game changer in the SETI search sky mapping speed. To better illustrate this point, so I've made here a sky projection showing all the breakthrough listen observations obtained so far with the Green Bank telescope. Those are the green dots, and the Parkes telescope are the red dots. And on the right is corresponding plots showing the unique number of stars observed as a function of time. Now, in the first years, we have published a catalog of about 1,000 stars, which has been a really big step up compared to a previous SETI effort. But with MeerKAT and VLA, things will look very different. MeerKAT, the blue point, it will give us MeerKAT, the telescope, will give us about 1 million stars in less than 2 years. And the VLA will actually be even faster because of a specific sky scanning mode of the telescope. It is going to scan large area of the northern sky and at the same time giving us really large sky coverage. So with the VLA, we are going to reach almost 100 million stars in roughly the same time frame. Another advantage of working with these multiple telescopes is that they can see the same sky or same targets at the same time. On the right, on the left, you can see a plot of MeerKAT, like from MeerKAT, and comparing MeerKAT to some other telescopes. How much overlap do they have in terms of sky coordinates? So MeerKAT being in the southern hemisphere, it has the best overlap with Parkes telescope, which is also in the southern hemisphere. So you can see that the red colored area is their overlap. So let's say the galactic center, which is at the declination of about -25, let's say. MeerKAT and Parkes, these two facilities, they can observe the galactic center together for about 3 hours during the day. So if you detect a signal of interest with MeerKAT, for example, we can point the Parkes telescope to look at it at the same time and try to verify the signal. In the northern hemisphere, the VLA telescope has the best overlap with Green Bank, and you see the overlap being the green region. And for example, the Vega star, as in the movie Contact, they found a signal from the Vega star. So if we found the same signal from Vega star, let's say, VLA and Green Bank, they can observe the Vega star together for about 13 hours in any given day. Now, this is a plot made by one of my students, Leo Risk, and he's at UFT, and Leo compared the figure of merits of previously conducted SETI searches. So Leo looked into the sky coverage and the observing frequencies, searched for any given project, and he has color-coded them using a 3-tier system that represents the sensitivity. So the red color represents highest sensitivity, basically projects that are able to detect an Arecibo-like signal out to 75 parsec. Yellow is for medium sensitivity, those that can detect Arecibo out to about 25 parsec, and low sensitivity is the blue ones that can detect Arecibo out to about 5 parsec. Now you can see here some of the earliest SETI searches began in like the 70s, 80s, and they tend to have low-ish sensitivity, and they are also very narrow in frequency range. Breakthrough Listen used Green Bank and Park. So these are the data points from the Berkeley Listen projects, and they have hugely improved in terms of the sky coverage and the frequency coverage and the sensitivity as well. So that's great. But the real improvement is going to come from MeerKAT, which is here, and the VLA. VLA is broken into different frequency bands, but these are all from VLA. You can see how MeerKAT and the VLA are both really on the top in terms of sky coverage. VLA is also great because it has a very wide frequency coverage and essentially giving us observations to observing bands that was never searched before. So we will have, we'll be able to derive any limit of whether there is presence of a SETI signal in these regions. Okay, and now remember the plan is to observe commensally. So one downside is that we don't get to choose where the telescope is pointing to. But we'll need the mechanism to find out. So if a telescope is pointing to some direction, what stars can we form beams on? Can we follow up, right? So we've derived a 26 million star catalog from the Gaia DR2 database. This plot here shows the stars that we have included in our catalog, and most of them are solar type stars. But I'd like to point out that almost 20,000 of those are within the so-called Earth Transit Zone, the ETZ. So what's that? You might have heard of the transit method, which is how we have detected most of the known exoplanets so far. Basically, we detect a dip in the light curve when the exoplanet transits in front of its host star. So we see the stars having a little bit less light, and because the exoplanet goes in front of it. The Earth transit zone is a region bracketing the ecliptic from which an extraterrestrial observer would be able to detect transit of the Earth in front of our stars. So the idea is that if there were other civilizations and if they were looking for exoplanets, they might have detected us on Earth using the transit method. And then they might want to broadcast radio signal towards our direction. So these stars could be interesting targets to search for SETI signal. And now most of the stars in our database is within 2 kiloparsec, and the closest 1 million star, which is shown by the dotted dashed line, the dashed line, is within 175 parsec. So it is somewhat comparable to the distances we talked about just now, the previous surveys that can detect an irreversible-like signal. The other thing we need to think about is source prioritization. So which of those 1 million stars should we observe first? The key idea here is to cover as many stars as possible rather than repeating on the same sets of sources. And we have a prioritization scheme here. The first priority to any source of high importance, for example, candidates from previous projects. You might have heard of the recent case of BLC1, which is a signal of interest detected with the Parkes telescope. And then after, we'll observe unobserved sources from the 26 million database. And then we could also observe sources from other databases. And after that, we could redo incomplete observations. So for example, if for some reason some of them were cut short or they have less than the full number of antennas. And beyond that, we could observe stars that were observed before, but at a different frequency band. And finally, if we exhausted the whole list, we could just reobserve the stars. Now, one of our students, Bart, he has been looking into other ways of further optimizing the search strategy. On the left, you can see here one of the randomly picked field of view seen by MeerKAT. Each of the cyan crosses represent stars, and in total, there are 1,052 stars in this one spot on the sky. and which is really a lot. And this is another proof why the small antenna of interferometer is interesting here, because it actually can see 1,000 stars in the same spot. Now, however, this is only one observation, and maybe the telescope is staying there for 10-15 minutes before it moves to somewhere else. So we need to be able to finish processing this pointing, because we'll be getting new stars. Now, we don't quite have the computational power to study 1,000 stars thoroughly in such a short time span, but we can afford to search 64 beams. Remember those blue cones that I shown in the earlier cartoon? So these are tiny patches of the sky within the area. So those are the small white circle. So we have enough computational power to process 64 of those. Now, to first order, we can point each of those blue cones, or like this beam stuff, to a different star. So we get 64 stars for every observation, which is pretty nice already. But BART has been developing new algorithms that would allow us to optimize this even further by drawing these 64 circles to areas where we can have a higher density of stars. So you see in this zoomed in plot where each of the circle has more than one stars. And by doing that, and by incorporating the priority scheme that we just talked about, BART is able to cover 167 stars using 64 beams, which is going to further improve our survey speed. Another thing we have to worry about is how to differentiate SETI signal from human-generated radio interference. Now, previously with the single dish telescope like GBT and the Green Bank and Parkes, what Berkeley has done is actually Berkeley buy out the telescope 10-20% of its time and to point to stars that we want to study. So we have control over where the telescope is pointing to. And the strategy we have been using is to do this sort of cadence observation shown in this plot on the left. The idea is that we'll first point to a star, let's say position A, and let's say there is a SETI signal there. You can see this simulated signal where we injected a drifting signal in that observation. So we observe star A, and then we'll point away to a slightly different position, let's say a B. And in principle, there should be nothing there because the SETI signal is from star A. And then we'll point the telescope back to A and B and A and B. By doing this on-off cadence, we will have a very stringent requirement for identifying a SETI signal. So the signal needs to happen 3 times in the A and not in the B. Yeah, one of my students, Peter Ma, and he's also from U of T, and he has been working on employing machine learning algorithms to help identify and cluster this specific cadence pattern to help spot the SETI signal. But with MeerKAT and VLA, because we are piggybacking on other observations, so we can't say, hey, point here, point there. We can't do this cadence observations. However, we can still do a similar spatial filtering using the beam set waveform.
I don't need it.
You don't need your.
So in this example, in this cartoon here, you'll see that the SETI signal, it will show up in one specific beam that corresponds to a star, whereas terrestrial interference would appear in all or most of the beams because of its near field nature, because it's from the Earth. So we'll see it in many beams. So this is a way we can use to separate out interference from SETI signal. And so another of my student, Zhang, has been working on this, and here are some examples of MeerKAT data Zhapeng has collected. So it's developing an interference flagging algorithm. So he first fit the bandpass, that's the blue line, and then he tried to identify regions of the frequency band where there are signals that are above a certain threshold, and that's the red line. And so he has highlighted the contaminated region in green. And so the idea is that if we see the same contamination in multiple pointings, and which, for example, you see here, there is this specific interference which shows up almost identically in another pointing, and also very similarly in here and here. If it's showing up in all these different beams, then we can say that they are most likely terrestrial interference and not a genuine SETI signal. Okay, putting all these pieces together, here's the schematic of our search data flow. So from the antenna, the digitized data it's being sent to the FPGA channelizer, and then through the multicast Ethernet to our GPU cluster. So the data rate coming out from the system is actually 1.7 terabits per second, which is a significant fraction of the entire cell phone network in North America at any given time. So it's really a lot of data to process. Inside the GPU cluster, we'll further channelize the data to have really high frequency resolution in order to look for this Doppler drifted signal. We have to form the beams to point to the stars that we want to study. We need to remove interference, and then we'll search for SETI. The standard algorithm has been the Doppler algorithm. But searching for SETI signal is really like looking for a needle in haystacks. So we are actively exploring new ways, such as machine learning algorithms, to help identify SETI from interference. Okay, this is a timeline of the two projects. MeerKAT is on the top. So here, last fall, we have built out half of the GPU cluster, and you can see a photo of it here. We have obtained Commensal observing with other projects, and I've shown you a plot of that earlier. So the plan is to install the remaining hardware later this year and be fully operational by 2022. The VLA project is at an earlier stage. Now, we actually obtained seed funding from a private donor in 2019, but unfortunately, because of COVID, the VLA observatory has been basically shut down much of 2020 and 2021. So we haven't been able to make a lot of progress in this meantime, but now things are opening up. So we should be very soon installing fibers and other hardware on site. The plan is to deploy a GPU cluster next year and be fully operational in 2023. Looking ahead, there are multinational square kilometer array, and there is also the US-led NGVLA, next generation VLA telescope. These two telescopes, they are expected to come online within the next decade, and they will be the most sensitive radio telescopes ever built. So we are very keen to perform SETI searches on these future facilities because they will give us the most stringent limit thus far on the presence of extraterrestrial intelligence. In summary, we have talked about some of the latest updates regarding SETI searching with radio telescopes. For MeerKAT and the VLA, well, MeerKAT, for example, we have been able to obtain Commensal observing with other projects. We've built out half of the hardware, and we are working a lot on the processing software pipeline these days, and there is a huge contribution from our students. Now, once fully operational, the MeerKAT and VLA SETI searches will enable the 1 million star goal of breakthrough listen within the next 2 years, and they will also provide key knowledge for conducting SETI searches with the square kilometer array and the next generation VLA telescopes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. So we'll have our Q&A session now. So we have a question. So Roger asks, can we detect planets that don't transit their stars?
Planets that don't transit what?
Uh,
I didn't
he
hear.
yeah, he asked that can we detect planets that don't transit their stars?
That
Their
don't
star.
transit the stars.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, so in our search technique, we don't rely on the transit method because so we would still be able to detect any technosignature. Let me just see if there's a good example. Basically we will, well, maybe this one. Yeah, so here in this schematic, I'm showing that we are pointing to, we can look at, in this case, 8 different stars, there are 8 different cones, right? Then we can look at 8 different sky positions at the same time. So in principle, if there were any technosignature coming from this patch of sky, we will be able to detect it. It doesn't need to be transiting or not. So we will be able to detect any technosignature, let's say, that are directing towards Earth, or it could be also a leakage if they are sort of broadcasting radio waves, and we might be able to detect any leakage from it.
Thank you.
I see a hand up from Stephanie.
Yeah, hey, Cherry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. First of all, good talk. That was really interesting. But my question is, you talked a lot about like terrestrial noise and how you can differentiate signals between noise, but there's a lot of unique like astronomical radio transients. And what are the main ways that you separate like something that's a really unique like radio emitter and this SETI signal? Because I guess we've never detected SETI signals, right?
Yeah, so I think we are relatively less worried about astrophysical signal because they are so different. I don't have an example in this particular slide deck, but I've shown the Voyager signal, right? And it looks like this, and you might think, well, it could be astrophysical, but actually this is a really tiny frequency range. I've noted here that this drift is 0.36 hertz per second. And typically in astrophysical data, we would never look into this high frequency resolution. If you remember when we worked on pulsars or fast radio bursts, we are talking about an emission bandwidth of several hundreds of megahertz or even gigahertz. And usually we have a frequency resolution of some hundreds or some tens or hundreds of kilohertz. And so we just wouldn't have seen anything like that. And so if you, so even the narrowest astrophysical signal would typically have some tens or hundreds of kilohertz in width. And so that is distinctly different from what we are looking for. The idea here is to search for signals that occupy hertz in frequency.
Interesting. So it really is just like
so actually I have a similar plot, but not in this slide deck, of a pulsar signal, and it would go like this.
I see. So it's
it would
just
have
the
spanned the whole
frequency
range. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Cherry.
And it's also why we can't really use we can't really use data from other projects to look for SETI. Let's say CHIME data from the CHIME radio telescope. Currently, it is no use for SETI search because the frequency bin is so wide. So anything like that would have been drowned out.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm sorry, I was asking about detecting planets that don't transit their star. And either I misunderstood your question, I didn't understand your answer, or you misunderstood my question. Because what I was trying to find out is not whether we can detect signals, but whether you can actually identify the very existence of a planet if it doesn't transit the star.
Right. Okay. I think maybe I understand better your question now. So yeah, that's right. Like first of, we can detect technosignature from any exoplanets, maybe even if they don't transit their star. So let's say this guy, we can detect signal from it. It's not transiting its stars. But maybe your question is afterwards, how do we verify where it comes from?
No, not really. My question is,
Okay.
can we detect the planet itself? I mean,
yeah, okay. Well, we here we are focused on looking for this technosignature, and we are not particularly looking out for transit, right? So like we can detect the signal from this direction in the sky, and well, for our project alone won't have the ability to tell you whether the signal comes from the star or could it be an exoplanet that is closely orbiting the star. We will then have to ask the community for help and use other facilities to follow up this direction to test out whether the signal comes from the stars, the exoplanets, or what object in this general direction. And like you said, indeed, there could be exoplanets that we don't know yet that belongs to this stellar system. Like if it's not transiting, we might not have easily detected it yet, right? So that's a whole other issue or a whole other research there.
yes,
But,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do have another question. How many stars would our radio waves reach by now?
Oh, signals from Earth. How many stars would our signals have reached?
Yeah.
Huh. That's an interesting question. Yeah. Now, this hard to answer that question because let's use this. Now, that's hard to answer the question because it depends how sensitive yeah, it always depends how sensitive the detector is, right? So if the extraterrestrial intelligence, if those civilizations, they have like super technology, they can detect extremely weak signals, then they might have seen us just from all this TV, radio stuff that we are leaking out, that we are not really directing to them, like they might have detected it. But if they don't have a sensitive signal detector, I mean, if they don't have a sensitive detector, they might be relatively close to us, then they wouldn't have seen us. So this is sort of asking this question the other way around. So here in this plot, we are showing how far out we can see other stuff, right? And we see other technosignature, and we used Arecibo as an example. So I guess we can think, yeah, roughly these distances. If the extraterrestrial civilizations, if they have similar detector as we do. But there are a lot of assumptions in here, so it's hard to give you a solid answer for this question.
Thank you. So we have another question. Would these next generation telescopes be sensitive to SETI signals from other galaxies?
Yeah. Yeah, it's another good question, but the answer is going to be very similar to what I just said. It depends on how bright the transmission is. If it is if there is extraterrestrial civilization in other galaxies, if they are emitting a really bright signal, then we might see it. But I think just going by the fact that we still haven't detected anything to date, I think even with the new generation telescopes, we will probably still be still expanding the horizon in our Milky Way galaxy. Yeah, I would bet we are still not quite good enough to reach to other galaxies.
Oh, okay, thank you. Do anyone else has any other questions? Seems like we don't. Okay, so I think it's a good time to wrap up our talk. I would like to thank Dr. Cherry for an amazing talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Appreciate you, everyone's time, and see you at our next event.